384 BC, the kingdom of Macedon, a frontier city called Stagira. It was a small port overlooking the Aegean Sea. From the perspective of mainland Greece, this was the periphery, the edge of civilization, but life flowed there nonetheless. And one day that year, a child was born. His name was Aristotle. His father, Nicomachus, served as personal physician to King Amyntas, the third of Macedon. This detail of his birth background is important. It explains why Aristotle's philosophy would diverge so fundamentally from Plato's. Nicomachus came from a special lineage. He belonged to the Asclepiadae, a family that claimed descent from Asclepius, the god of medicine himself. In this family, medical knowledge was transmitted from father to son in secret. Anatomy, pharmacology, methods of patient observation, all of it passed down orally, hand to hand, directly through practice. Young Aristotle must have followed his father everywhere, witnessing all of this firsthand: the dissection of dead animals, the way a heart beats, the mechanism by which lungs breathe, the process of wounds healing. These things unfolded right before his eyes. Later, when he would write that all human beings by nature desire to know, that knowing was not some abstract notion. It meant touching with your hands, seeing with your eyes, verifying directly. If Plato viewed the world through the eyes of a mathematician, Aristotle saw it through the eyes of a physician. But this peaceful childhood did not last long. Around the age of 10, both his parents passed away. The records are not detailed, but it was likely disease. In those days, even physicians could not save their own lives. Suddenly orphaned, the boy was taken in by Proxenus, the husband of his older sister Arymneste. Proxenus was an educator. He taught young Aristotle Greek language, rhetoric, and poetry. He trained him thoroughly in writing, so thoroughly, in fact, that centuries later, Cicero would evaluate him thus, quote, "If Plato's prose is silver, then Aristotle's is a flowing river of gold," end quote. Imagine this for a moment. The sense of loss that a 10-year-old child must have felt, losing both parents. It must have been an experience of the world collapsing. But at the same time, perhaps this very experience made him resilient. Perhaps this is why he would contemplate friendship so deeply throughout his entire life. Only those who have lost something understand the preciousness of relationships. 7 years passed this way. At 17, Aristotle was led by Proxenus onto a ship. The destination was Athens, the intellectual center of the Greek world at that time. He was to enroll at Plato's academy. When the ship docked at port, what did he see? The magnificence of the Parthenon, the bustle of the agora, philosophers engaged in debate. But at the same time, he must have understood his position precisely. He was not Athenian, metoikos, foreign resident. This word would define his entire life. Ametikos had no rights. They could not purchase land. They could not own a house. They could not vote. They could not hold public office. Even marriage to an Athenian citizen was illegal. They paid higher taxes, and when war came, they were drafted into the military, but citizenship was never granted. And most importantly, they needed a patron. Without a citizen sponsor called a prostates, their property could be confiscated, and they could even be sold into slavery. It was a life of perpetual dependence on someone else. Aristotle lived 67 years. He spent nearly 50 of those years in Athens. But until the day he died, he never became a citizen. Here arises a paradox. He wrote the Politics. He defined human beings as, quote, "by nature political animals," end quote. He argued that only in the polis, the city-state, can human beings truly become fully human. He classified 6 types of political systems, discussed the best form of government, and collected and analyzed the constitutions of 158 city-states. Yet he himself could never participate in politics. A man who never cast a single vote discussed democracy. A man who could not hold public office taught about the virtues of rulers. A foreigner without citizenship lectured on the duties of citizens. Is this tragedy, or was it perhaps a blessing? Those on the outside can see what's inside. Things that those within take for granted appear strange. When viewed from without, Athenian citizens took their political system for granted, but Aristotle could analyze it objectively, not with emotion, but with logic, not with attachment, but with observation. Consider this for a moment. Think about when you were pushed out at work, when you felt unwelcome in your organization, when you thought your place no longer existed. That feeling. Aristotle lived with that feeling his entire life. But that very position made him free, because those on the outside can see what those on the inside cannot. The night Aristotle fled Athens, heading to Chalcis, his mother's hometown, what was he thinking? Did he feel regret, or was he relieved? We will now trace back through that 62-year journey, from his birth in Stagira, a small city on the Macedonian frontier, to becoming a philosopher of Athens, from emerging out of Plato's shadow to standing independently, through loving, losing, and rising again, and finally to becoming the father of Western thought. But remember this one thing: he was not a perfect saint. He defended slavery. He denigrated women. He made many scientific errors. Yet despite all this, or perhaps precisely because of it, his story resonates with us, because we too are imperfect. We too make mistakes, harbor prejudices, and are trapped by the limitations of our time, and yet we live, just as Aristotle did. So shall we begin this journey? 384 BC, the kingdom of Macedon, the frontier city of Stagira. It was a small port overlooking the Aegean Sea. From the perspective of mainland Greece, it was the periphery, but life flowed there nonetheless. One day that year, a child was born. His name was Aristotle. His father, Nicomachus, was the personal physician to King Amyntas, the third of Macedon. This birth background matters. It explains why Aristotle's philosophy would become fundamentally different from Plato's. Nicomachus came from a special family, the Asclepiadae, a lineage that claimed descent from Asclepius, the god of medicine. In this family, medical knowledge was transmitted from father to son in secret. Anatomy, pharmacology, methods of patient observation, all of it taught orally, hand to hand, directly. Young Aristotle must have followed his father around, watching all of this. Scenes of dissecting dead animals, the way a heart beats, the principle of how lungs breathe, the process of wounds healing. These things unfolded right before his eyes. When he later said that all human beings by nature desire to know, that knowing was not abstract contemplation. It was touching with hands, seeing with eyes, verifying directly. If Plato saw the world through a mathematician's eyes, Aristotle saw the world through a physician's eyes. But this peaceful childhood did not last long. Around age 10, both parents passed away. The records are not detailed, but it was probably disease. In those days, even physicians could not save their own lives. The boy, suddenly orphaned, was taken in by Proxenus, the husband of his sister Arymneste. Proxenus was an educator. He taught young Aristotle Greek, rhetoric, and poetry. He trained him thoroughly in writing. Centuries later, Cicero would evaluate him thus, quote, "If Plato's prose is silver, Aristotle's is a flowing river of gold." End quote. Imagine this for a moment. The loss a 10-year-old child feels when both parents die. It must have been an experience of the world collapsing. But perhaps this very experience made him strong. Perhaps this is why he contemplated friendship so deeply throughout his life. Only those who have lost understand the preciousness of relationships. 7 years passed this way. At 17, Aristotle was led by Proxenus onto a ship. The destination was Athens, the intellectual center of the Greek world at that time. He would enroll at Plato's academy there. When the ship reached port, what did he see? The majesty of the Parthenon, the bustle of the agora, philosophers debating, but at the same time, he must have known his position precisely. He was not Athenian, metoikos, foreign resident. This word would define his entire life. A metoikos had no rights, could not buy land, could not own a house, could not vote, could not participate in politics. Even marriage to an Athenian citizen was illegal. They paid more taxes and were conscripted when war came, but citizenship was never granted. And most importantly, they needed a patron. Without a citizen guarantor called a prostates, their property could be confiscated and they could be sold into slavery. It was a life of having to depend on someone for their entire existence. Aristotle lived 67 years. He spent nearly 50 of them in Athens. But he never became a citizen, not until the day he died. Here arises a paradox. He wrote the Politics. He defined human beings as, quote, by nature political animals, end quote. He said that only in the polis, the city-state, can humans truly become fully human. He classified 6 types of political systems, discussed the best form of government, collected and analyzed the constitutions of 158 city-states, yet he himself could never participate in politics. A man who never cast a vote discussed democracy. A man barred from public office taught about the virtues of rulers. A foreigner without citizenship lectured on the duties of citizens. Is this tragedy, or was it perhaps a blessing? Those on the outside can see what's inside. Things that those within take for granted appear strange when viewed from without. Athenian citizens took their political system for granted, but Aristotle could analyze it objectively. Not with emotion, but with logic. Not with attachment, but with observation. Consider this for a moment. Think about when you were pushed out at work, when you felt unwelcome in your organization, when you thought your place no longer existed. That feeling. Aristotle lived with that feeling his entire life. But that very position made him free, because those on the outside can see what those on the inside cannot. The night Aristotle fled Athens, heading to Chalcis, his mother's hometown, what was he thinking? Did he feel regret, or was he relieved? We will now trace back through that 62-year journey, from his birth in Stagira, a small city on the Macedonian frontier, to becoming a philosopher of Athens, from emerging out of Plato's shadow to standing independently, through loving, losing, and rising again, and finally to becoming the father of Western thought. But remember this one thing. He was not a perfect saint. He defended slavery. He denigrated women. He made many scientific errors. Yet despite all this, or perhaps precisely because of it, his story resonates with us. Because we too are imperfect. We too make mistakes, harbor prejudices, and are trapped by the limitations of our time. And yet we live, just as Aristotle did. So shall we begin this journey? 384 BC, the kingdom of Macedon, the frontier city of Stagira. It was a small port overlooking the Aegean Sea. From the perspective of mainland Greece, it was the periphery, but life flowed there nonetheless. One day that year, a child was born. His name was Aristotle. His father, Nicomachus, was the personal physician to King Amyntas III of Macedon. This birth background matters. It explains why Aristotle's philosophy would become fundamentally different from Plato's. Nicomachus came from a special family, the Asclepiadae, a lineage that claimed descent from Asclepius, the god of medicine. In this family, medical knowledge was transmitted from father to son in secret. Anatomy, pharmacology, methods of patient observation, all of it taught orally, hand to hand, directly. Young Aristotle must have followed his father around, watching all of this. Scenes of dissecting dead animals, the way a heart beats, the principle of how lungs breathe, the process of wounds healing. These things unfolded right before his eyes. When he later said that all human beings by nature desire to know, that knowing was not abstract contemplation, it was touching with hands, seeing with eyes, verifying directly. If Plato saw the world through a mathematician's eyes, Aristotle saw the world through a physician's eyes. But this peaceful childhood did not last long. Around age 10, both parents passed away. The records are not detailed, but it was probably disease. In those days, even physicians could not save their own lives. The boy, suddenly orphaned, was taken in by Proxenus, the husband of his sister Arymneste. Proxenus was an educator. He taught young Aristotle Greek, rhetoric, and poetry. He trained him thoroughly in writing. Centuries later, Cicero would evaluate him thus, quote, "If Plato's prose is silver, Aristotle's is a flowing river of gold. End quote. Imagine this for a moment. The loss a 10-year-old child feels when both parents die. It must have been an experience of the world collapsing. But perhaps this very experience made him strong. Perhaps this is why he contemplated friendship so deeply throughout his life. Only those who have lost understand the preciousness of relationships. 7 years passed this way. At 17, Aristotle was led by Proxenus onto a ship. The destination was Athens, the intellectual center of the Greek world at that time. He would enroll at Plato's academy there. When the ship reached port, what did he see? The majesty of the Parthenon, the bustle of the agora, philosophers debating, but at the same time, he must have known his position precisely. He was not Athenian, metoikos, foreign resident. This word would define his entire life. A metoikos had no rights, could not buy land, could not own a house, could not vote, could not participate in politics. Even marriage to an Athenian citizen was illegal. They paid more taxes and were conscripted when war came, but citizenship was never granted. And most importantly, they needed a patron. Without a citizen guarantor called a prostates, their property could be confiscated and they could be sold into slavery. It was a life of having to depend on someone for their entire existence. Aristotle lived 67 years. He spent nearly 50 of them in Athens. But he never became a citizen, not until the day he died. Here arises a paradox. He wrote the Politics. He defined human beings as, quote, by nature political animals, end quote. He said that only in the polis, the city-state, can humans truly become fully human. He classified 6 types of political systems, discussed the best form of government, collected and analyzed the constitutions of 158 city-states. Yet he himself could never participate in politics. A man who never cast a vote discussed democracy. A man barred from public office taught about the virtues of rulers. A foreigner without citizenship lectured on the duties of citizens. Is this tragedy, or was it perhaps a blessing? Those on the outside can see what's inside. Things that those within take for granted appear strange when viewed from without. Athenian citizens took their political system for granted, but Aristotle could analyze it objectively. Not with emotion, but with logic. Not with attachment, but with observation. Consider this. Think about when you were pushed out at work, when you felt unwelcome in your organization. That moment when you thought, my accumulated career means nothing. That self-loathing of thinking, I am no longer a needed person. But there are things you can see precisely because you are outside. When you were inside, you were too busy reading the room, playing politics, just surviving. But once you're outside, you finally see it. The organization's problems, the system's contradictions, the irrationality of its customs. This was Aristotle. He could be objective precisely because he remained a foreigner his entire life. He could criticize Athens coldly because he did not love it. Because he was not a citizen, he could search for universal principles. When that 17-year-old youth set foot in Athens, he must have already known. He would remain a foreigner forever. But perhaps that was his destiny. The one who sees from outside. The one who observes objectively. The one who dissects the world with a physician's eye. That young man now goes to meet Plato, into the shadow of a giant. 367 BC, 17-year-old Aristotle passed through the gates of Athens. In the northern suburbs of the city, there was a sacred grove dedicated to the hero Academus. There stood Plato's school, the Academy, the most prestigious philosophical school in the Greek world at that time. But as it happened, Plato was not there. He had left for Syracuse in Sicily in the midst of executing his ambitious plan to transform the tyrant Dionysius II into a philosopher king. The school was being temporarily run by the mathematician Eudoxus. Young Aristotle enrolled in a school without its master, and he remained there for 20 years. From 367 to 347, he began as a student, became a researcher, and later became a teacher, lecturing on rhetoric. Even after becoming an adult, he did not leave. Why was that? When Plato returned, he immediately recognized the brilliance of this young man. so he gave him a nickname. No, meaning mind, intelligence, or anagnostes, meaning reader. It meant he was the student who read the most and thought the most deeply in the school. The teacher cherished his student. The student respected his teacher. But the two men were fundamentally different. Plato was a mathematician. At the entrance to the academy, these words were supposedly inscribed, quote, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter," end quote. He believed that beyond the changing world, there existed eternal and unchanging truth. That was the idea, the form. Real horses age, sicken, and die. But the form of horse is eternal, perfect, unchanging, beautiful. The reality we see is merely an imperfect shadow of that form. The famous allegory of the cave, that philosophy. In contrast, Aristotle was a physician. He began with what he could touch with his hands and see with his eyes. Living horses, aging horses, dying horses. These were real. The form was not floating somewhere up in the sky, but right here inside this horse, he thought. The essence that makes a horse does not exist separately from individual horses. The difference between the two men was clear. Plato asked, what is truly real? His answer, the forms. Aristotle also asked, what is truly real? His answer, this individual thing. Plato looked upward, Aristotle looked forward. As the years passed, the student became increasingly bold. He began to publicly criticize his teacher's theories, especially the theory of forms. Plato's theory goes like this: you and I, and that person walking over there, we are all human. Why are we human? Plato says it's because we all resemble the perfect archetype called the form of human. But Aristotle asked, quote, "Teacher, let me ask you something. You say that you and I are human because we resemble the form of human, correct? Fine. But consider this. I and the form of human, are we not similar as well? Both have the commonality of being human, don't we?" End quote. Quote, "Then why are the form and I similar? Don't we need another form? Then what about the similarity between that new form and the original form? Yet another form? Doesn't this go on infinitely?" End quote. Put simply, this is it. Twins look alike because they resemble their parents. Okay, but why do the twins and parents look alike? Because they resemble the grandparents. Then why do parents and grandparents look alike? Great-grandparents? Great-great-grandparents? There is no end. Following Plato's logic, you would need an infinite number of forms. This doesn't solve the problem, it creates a new one. And Aristotle posed a more direct question. Quote, "If that perfect form is floating somewhere up in the sky, what does it have to do with this person here on earth? This person before my eyes still ages, sickens, and dies. How does that perfect form of human up there prevent this?" End quote. Think of a patient lying in a hospital bed. A doctor comes and says, "Don't worry, somewhere up in the sky there exists a perfect form of health." What would the patient say? So how does that cure my illness? Aristotle struck precisely at this point. What meaning does perfection detached from reality have? What did the teacher think of such a student? An ancient biographer named Diogenes Laertius passes down this saying, quote, "Aristotle kicks me, just as a colt kicks its mother horse." End quote. This is supposedly what Plato said. There is a sadness in it. I raised him, and now he kicks me. But at the same time, there is understanding. Colts are like that by nature. When they grow up, leaving is natural. Nevertheless, Aristotle respected Plato. In the Nicomachean Ethics, there is this passage. Quote, "Plato is dear, but truth is dearer." End quote. In Latin it's amicus Plato, sed magis amica veritas. Friend Plato, but truth is more a friend. There's a reason this sentence has been quoted for 2,400 years. Because there is pain in it. When the opinion of someone you love differs from the truth, what should we do? Aristotle was clear. You must choose truth, even if it seems like betraying your teacher, even if it makes you lonely because of it. You have probably experienced such moments. The moment when you knew your boss was wrong but couldn't speak up. The moment when you knew your parents' values didn't fit the times but remained silent. The moment when you knew the organization's customs were irrational but followed them anyway. Aristotle did not remain silent. He criticized. For 20 years, he directly refuted the theories of the teacher who had shown him kindness. Was it courage or was it arrogance? Perhaps it was both. And then came 347. Plato died. He was 80 years old. He attended a wedding banquet, felt unwell, and passed away a few days later. The Academy had to elect a new head. Who would it be? Would it naturally be Aristotle? It was not. Speusippus, Plato's nephew, was chosen, not Aristotle. Why was that? First, he was a metoikos. He had no citizenship, could not own property. Legally, he was not qualified to run the school. Second, anti-Macedonian sentiment. At that time, Athens feared Philip II's Macedon. Aristotle was from Macedon. Third, philosophical differences. Speusippus wanted to continue Plato's theory of ideas, the philosophy of mathematics and forms. But Aristotle was already walking a different path, the one not chosen. 37-year-old Aristotle left the school where he had spent 20 years. His teacher was dead and there was no place for him. He packed his belongings and left Athens. What was in his heart? Betrayal, anger, liberation, or emptiness? Think back to the experience of being passed over by a junior at work. Why wasn't I chosen when I worked here so long, when I devoted myself like this? That bitterness. But sometimes leaving is a greater beginning. If he had remained at the Academy, Aristotle would have lived his entire life as Plato's disciple, in his teacher's shadow, writing commentaries, refining theories, training successors. An honorable life. But that would have been all. Because he left, he became free. Now no one called him Plato's disciple. He could now be himself, under his own name, Aristotle. He headed to Asia Minor, to a small city called Assos across the sea. There his old fellow student Hermeias was waiting. A new life was about to begin, a time of love and loss. For those who have left, there are two paths: to cling to the past and live in resentment, or to start anew in a new place. Aristotle chose the latter. 347 BC, 37-year-old Aristotle crossed the Aegean Sea, leaving behind Athens, where he had spent 20 years, leaving behind his teacher's tomb, choosing to forget the school that had not chosen him. The ship headed to Assos, a small port city in Asia Minor. There, an old fellow student was waiting, Hermeias. Once a slave, but through wisdom and courage, he had become the ruler of a small territory, a friend who had studied together at the Academy. He welcomed Aristotle warmly. Quote, "I have been waiting for you. Start anew here." End quote. He gave him a house, prepared a research room, and gathered students for him. And he introduced his adopted daughter. Her name was Pythias. Some records say she was his niece. The 37-year-old philosopher and the young woman locked eyes. We do not know their conversations. What words were exchanged, at what moment hearts opened. There are no records. But what is certain is this: they fell in love, married, and had a daughter. That child was also called Pythias, after her mother's name. The time in Assos was peaceful. In the mornings, he discussed politics with Hermeias. In the afternoons, he taught his students. In the evenings, he walked with Pythias, gazing at the sea. At night, he read and wrote. It was a time to organize his own thoughts completely for the first time, emerging from Plato's shadow. You have probably experienced such moments. When you leave a position you endured for so long, at first it feels empty and anxious. But as time passes, you actually feel freer, that realization of, now I can live as myself. This was Aristotle. He was no longer Plato's disciple. Now he was himself. He had a wife, he had a friend, he had students. He must have been happy. But happiness did not last long. 341 BC, Artaxerxes III of the Persian Empire arrested Hermeias. The charge was treason. In reality, it was for communicating with Philip II of Macedon. But what Persia really wanted was information. Quote, "Tell us Philip's invasion plans." End quote. Torture began. They pulled out his fingernails, twisted his joints, and tore his flesh. The Persian soldiers kept asking, "Tell us Philip's plans, the size of his army, the timing of invasion, the routes." Hermeias never opened his mouth to the end, and at the final moment, just before being hung on the cross, he is said to have spoken these words, quote, "I have done nothing shameful to philosophy, nor anything unworthy." End quote. His friend died on the cross. When Aristotle received the news, he must have collapsed. The person who accepted him, the person who helped him start anew, the person who introduced him to his wife, he had died under torture, and the one who had ordered the arrest was the Persian Empire. But who had informed on Hermeias? There were rumors it was someone from Macedon, perhaps someone who wanted to remove this connection between Aristotle and Philip. Pain, anger, helplessness. What could Aristotle do? He could not wage war, could not take revenge, could not even claim the body, so he did what he could do. He wrote a poem, a hymn praising Hermeias, a poem honoring his courage and philosophy. He had it performed publicly and erected a statue of Hermeias in Delphi. This poem would later become evidence of impiety, the charge that would drive Aristotle out of Athens, because hymns were supposed to be for gods, not humans. But Aristotle did not care. His friend deserved to be honored. The poem begins like this, quote, "Virtue, the hardest labor for humankind, the fairest prize of life," end quote. And it ends like this, quote, "For your beauty's sake, Hermeias, he chose to die, never betraying his friends. Therefore your fame shall be immortal," end quote. 2,300 years have passed. Hermeias' name has indeed become immortal, because his friend remembered him. Have you ever lost someone precious? Not just death, but the loss of someone who believed in you, who supported you, who gave you a chance. That empty feeling when that person is no longer there. Aristotle experienced that. But he did not collapse. He mourned, wrote poetry, honored his memory, and then moved forward again. Because life had to go on. He left Assos. It was too painful to remain there. Every corner reminded him of Hermeias. He moved to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos. There he met a young scholar named Theophrastus. This person would later become his successor. And 3 years passed. 343 BC, a letter arrived from Macedon. King Philip II was summoning him. Quote, "Come and teach my son," end quote. The son's name was Alexander, a 13-year-old boy, a boy who would later conquer the world. Aristotle had to make a decision. Should he go? Macedon, where anti-Macedonian sentiment was rising in Athens. Teaching a conqueror's son. Would this choice become poison later? Or should he refuse? But this was a king's command. And more importantly, it was an opportunity to educate a future king, to put philosophy into practice. Aristotle chose to go. At 39, he became tutor to the prince. And for the next 3 years, in a place called Myesa, he would teach the boy everything he knew. Politics, ethics, literature, science, rhetoric. And above all, how to be human. Did he succeed? We do not know. Alexander conquered the world but killed his friends, burned cities, and died young. Was that success or failure? But what is certain is this. Aristotle tried. He taught wisdom to power. He attempted to make a philosopher king. Just as Plato had tried in Syracuse, Aristotle tried in Macedon. Both failed. But perhaps the attempt itself was meaningful. After all, we too try, don't we? We raise children not knowing how they will turn out. We teach students not knowing what they will become. We try to change the world not knowing if we will succeed. Aristotle was the same. He taught, hoped, and then let go. Because that is all we can do. 343 BC, in the gardens of Myesa, a sanctuary in the hills of Macedon, a 39-year-old philosopher faced a 13-year-old boy. The boy's name was Alexander, son of King Philip II, a restless, intelligent, ambitious child. What did Aristotle teach him? We do not know in detail. The textbooks have not survived. But we know some things. He taught Homer. Alexander would carry the Iliad with him for his entire life, keeping it under his pillow. He saw himself as a new Achilles. He taught politics and ethics. how to rule justly, how to treat subjects, what makes a good king. He taught natural science, biology, geography, meteorology. Later, during his campaigns, Alexander would send back specimens of plants and animals from all over the world to Aristotle. He taught the value of Greek culture, philosophy, art, literature, to spread these to the world. Did young Alexander listen well? It seems he did at first. He admired his teacher and absorbed knowledge eagerly. There are records of him asking questions, engaging in debates, thinking deeply. But as he grew older, something changed. 336 BC, Philip was assassinated. Alexander became king at age 20. The boy who had listened to philosophy now commanded armies. He launched his eastern campaign, conquered Persia, marched through Egypt, reached India, established 70 cities, spread Greek culture across the world, and killed, burned, and destroyed. He executed Philotas, his friend, on charges of conspiracy, killed Clytus, who had saved his life in a drunken rage, forced his soldiers to intermarry with Persians, began demanding they prostrate before him as if he were a god. What did Aristotle think? He must have been conflicted, pride and disappointment. His student was changing the world, but not in the way he had taught. Power was not being tempered by wisdom. Conquest was not being guided by ethics. And then 330 BC arrived. Alexander ordered the execution of Aristotle's nephew, Callisthenes. The crime, refusing to prostrate before Alexander. Callisthenes was a historian who had been documenting Alexander's campaigns, and he was Aristotle's own family. Quote, "I will not bow down as if before a god. Kings are human." End quote. These words cost him his life. He was arrested on charges of conspiracy and died in prison. Some say he was tortured. When the news reached Aristotle, what did he feel? His student had killed his nephew. The boy he had taught had destroyed his family. 20 years of effort, what had it produced? But Aristotle said nothing publicly. He did not criticize Alexander, did not condemn him. Perhaps he could not. Alexander was the most powerful man in the world, and Aristotle was still just a metakos in Athens. Or perhaps he understood. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Even the best education cannot overcome human nature. Consider this. You raise children with all your heart, teach them everything you know, model good behavior, but they grow up and make their own choices. Sometimes those choices break your heart. What can you do then? You cannot control them, cannot force them to live as you wish. All you can do is love them, even when disappointed, and hope that somewhere deep inside your teachings remain. Aristotle did that. He did not disown Alexander, did not erase him from memory. He simply acknowledged that his student had gone his own way, and he continued his own work. 335 BC, Alexander was in the east. Athens was stable. Aristotle, now 50 years old, returned to Athens. 13 years had passed since he left. Plato was long dead. The academy had changed. Athens itself felt different. But he did not go back to the academy. He founded his own school. In the northeast of Athens, near the temple of Apollo Lyceus, he established the Lyceum, a school that would bear his own name, teach his own philosophy, walk his own path. There were covered walkways called the peripatos. He would walk these paths with students, discussing philosophy as they strolled. Hence his followers were called the peripatetics, the walkers. He organized systematic research, biology, politics, ethics, logic, metaphysics, rhetoric, poetry, every field of human knowledge. He collected books, established the first real library in Greece, gathered specimens, documented observations, built an intellectual empire, and he taught every morning and evening. Esoteric lectures for advanced students in the morning, exoteric lectures for the general public in the evening. For 12 years, the Lyceum flourished. It became the intellectual center of the Greek world, rivaling even the academy. These were Aristotle's golden years. He was no longer anyone's student, no longer anyone's employee. He was his own master, teaching his own philosophy. He had also formed a new relationship. After Pythias died, He lived with a woman named Hermeias. She came from his hometown of Stagira. They were not legally married because she was not Athenian, but they lived as partners. They had a son together named Nicomachus after Aristotle's father. This was his family now, not the conventional kind, but real nonetheless. Hermeias, young Nicomachus, his daughter Pythias, and his students, who were like sons to him. He had built a life, not perfect but his own. Have you ever experienced this? After years of struggle, after loss and disappointment, finally arriving at a place that is yours. Not everything you dreamed of, but something real, something you built with your own hands. That is how Aristotle must have felt. At the Lyceum, teaching on the Peripatos, surrounded by students and books, conducting research, living with his family. He was content. But nothing lasts forever. 323 BC, a messenger arrived from Babylon with devastating news. Alexander the Great was dead. The conqueror of the world, dead at 32 from fever. His empire, built in 13 years, began to fracture immediately. And in Athens, the news sparked something else. Celebration. The Macedonian oppressor was gone. Athens could be free again. Anti-Macedonian sentiment exploded into the streets. Aristotle understood immediately. He was Macedonian. He had tutored Alexander. In the eyes of many Athenians, he was the enemy. Within days, charges were brought against him. Impiety, the same charge that had killed Socrates. The evidence, that hymn he had written for Hermeias decades ago. It was a pretext, of course. The real crime was being associated with Macedon, with Alexander, with the conquest that had humiliated Athens. Aristotle was 62 years old. He had spent 35 years building the Lyceum, building his life. Now it was all at risk. He could stay and fight the charges, plead his case, defend himself, or he could leave. He chose to leave. Quote, "I will not permit the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy." End quote. That night he began packing. But what is certain is this: Alexander's death changed Aristotle's fate as well. Anti-Macedonian sentiment exploded in Athens, and that anger turned toward the person who had been closest to Macedon. That person was Aristotle. But before we go to that story, we must turn back the clock 12 years. 335 BC, the very year Alexander ascended to the throne. 50-year-old Aristotle returned to Athens, to the city he had left 12 years earlier when Plato died, and he was not chosen as successor. This time it was different. This time he had come to found his own school. But there was a problem. He was still a metoikos. He could not own property, could not buy land. Then how could he establish a school? Aristotle chose to rent. In the eastern suburbs of Athens, there was a gymnasium called the Lyceum. It was a public facility dedicated to Apollo Lyceus, the wolf Apollo, a spacious area with an exercise ground and walking paths. Quote, "I will rent this place." End quote. And so the Lyceum was born. He could not own it, but there a new chapter of Western thought opened. This school was different from the academy. If Plato's school focused on mathematics and the philosophy of forms, Aristotle's school covered everything: philosophy, biology, politics, ethics, rhetoric, poetics. They researched, classified, and recorded all knowledge of the world. And he had a unique habit: teaching while walking. At the Lyceum there was a covered walkway called the Peripatos. Aristotle would walk back and forth along it, conversing with his students. One lap, then another lap, continuously walking as he spoke. Quote, "Teacher, why do you teach while walking?" End quote. Quote, "Because walking makes thought move. When the body stops, the mind stops too." End quote. And so his school came to be called the Peripatetics. It means the walkers. There were two types of lectures. In the morning, there were advanced lectures for internal students only. Esoteric lectures, intimate teachings. They dealt with difficult subjects like metaphysics, logic, and natural philosophy. The doors were closed and outsiders could not enter. In the afternoon, there were lectures open to the public. Exoteric lectures, public teachings. Practical subjects like rhetoric, ethics, and politics. Any Athenian citizen could come and listen. They were free. Why this division? Because he believed knowledge has stages. Anyone can understand ethics, but he thought only prepared people can approach metaphysics, like training beginners and athletes differently at a gymnasium. But the Lyceum was not merely a lecture hall. It was a research institute, the first true research university. Aristotle gave his students assignments. Quote, collect the constitutions of all Greek city-states. End quote. Students scattered to various places: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. They recorded the political systems of 158 city-states. Quote, now let us analyze. What systems are stable? Why do some states flourish while others perish? End quote. The Politics was born this way. It was not a simple theoretical text, but the result of vast data analysis. He also built a library, one of the first great libraries in the ancient world. He collected papyrus scrolls, drew maps, and gathered plant and animal specimens. There were even rare plants and animals sent from the east by Alexander's expeditions. Quote, look at this, elephant bone from India. Let us observe the joint structure. End quote. The Lyceum was a living, breathing space of knowledge. And above all, Aristotle was free there. He had emerged from Plato's shadow, was no longer anyone's student, and now taught under his own name. It was a new life begun at age 50. Isn't 50 too late, you ask? Not at all. All of Aristotle's greatest achievements came during this period. The Nicomachean Ethics, the Politics, the Rhetoric, the Poetics, major parts of the Metaphysics, all of these were written in his 50s. The prime of life is not determined by age. His personal life also began anew. His first wife Pythias had already passed away, but Aristotle met a woman from Stagira. Her name was Hermeias. Some records say they married, others say they lived together. A son was born between them. His name was Nicomachus. It was his father's name and his grandfather's name. Later, the ethics book Aristotle wrote would be titled The Nicomachean Ethics. It was a book dedicated to his son and to his father. 12 years passed. From 335 to 323, the most brilliant time in Aristotle's life. Every morning he walked the peripatos conversing with students. In the afternoons he lectured to Athenian citizens. In the evenings he researched and wrote. Hermeias would put their son to bed, and he would take up his pen under the lamplight. Quote, all human beings by nature desire to know. End quote. The first sentence of the Metaphysics, not written by a 68-year-old man, but by a 50-year-old in middle age. The sentence of someone who still wanted to learn, still felt wonder, still wanted to unlock the world's secrets. These were ordinary days. There were no grand events, no wars, no conquests, no revolutions. Just days of teaching a little, writing a little, organizing a little, every single day. But it was precisely in that ordinariness that greatness was born. Brilliant achievements usually do not come in dramatic moments. It is things built up faithfully day by day that suddenly become a great edifice. This was Aristotle. Those 12 years at the Lyceum. Quiet but solid time. Students came, learned, and left. Books accumulated, knowledge built up, and systems were completed. And he did not know that this peace would soon end. June 11th, 323 BC. Far away in Babylon, Alexander died. When the news reached Athens, the city erupted. Quote, the Macedonian tyrant is dead. Now we are free. End quote. People gathered in the square, speakers shouted, and anti-Macedonian sentiment exploded. And that anger turned toward one person, the philosopher who had taught Alexander, from Macedon, not Greek, Aristotle. One evening, a priest named Eurymedon filed charges. The accusation was impiety, that he had written a poem praising his dead friend Hermeias. The official reason was that he had exalted a human as if he were a god. But everyone knew. The real reason was political. Aristotle, walking the paths of the Lyceum, stopped. He would have to stand trial, just as Socrates had 79 years before. But he made a different choice. What was the 68-year-old man thinking, facing trial? Death, flight, excuses, probably all of those. But at the same time, he must have recalled one question he had devoted his life to. Quote, "What exactly is a good life?" End quote. This question was the subject Aristotle addressed most at the Lyceum. Every morning, walking the peripatos, in afternoon lectures, in evening writing sessions, he asked it endlessly. And the answer he found, that was eudaimonia. It is usually translated as happiness, but that is not accurate. When we say happiness, we think of a pleasant state, laughing, enjoying, satisfied feelings. But eudaimonia is not an emotion. More precisely, it is flourishing, thriving, the realization of human excellence. Aristotle wrote this, quote, "The human good is activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are multiple virtues, in accordance with the best and most complete virtue. Moreover, this must be in a complete life." End quote. A bit difficult, right? Let me unpack it. Now think of a tree. What is a good tree? A tree with deep roots, strong branches, lush leaves, bearing fruit. A tree fulfilling its function as a tree properly. That is a good tree. Then what is a good human being? Fulfilling the unique function of a human properly. What is that? Animals also eat, sleep, and reproduce. Plants also grow. But what only humans have, that is reason. Therefore, a good life is a life of using reason excellently. But here an important word appears. Activity. Happiness is not a state, but an activity. It is not the moment when you feel I am happy. The very process of living while practicing virtue is happiness. Like an athlete who enjoys not the moment of winning a competition, but the process itself of training and sweating. Aristotle left a famous metaphor. Quote, "One swallow does not make a spring, nor does one day's pleasure make a person happy." End quote. Just because one good thing happened, just because you succeeded once, just because you felt joy once, does not make a happy life. Happiness is a lifelong project. Why does this matter? People today think of happiness as moments. If I go on vacation, I will be happy. If I get promoted, I will be happy. If I win the lottery, I will be happy. But vacations end, stress continues after promotion, and many lottery winners become more unhappy a few years later. Why? Because they saw happiness as a destination. Aristotle says happiness is not a destination, but a journey. Practicing virtue a little each day, trying to live rationally a little each day, trying to improve a little each day, that process itself is happiness. At the Lyceum, Aristotle did the same things every day. He walked the peripatos, taught students, conducted research, and wrote. It was not glamorous, not dramatic either, but every day he used his reason, every day he shared knowledge, and every day he tried to get a little closer to truth. That was his eudaimonia. Modern psychology has proven this. There is a psychologist named Martin Seligman, the founder of positive psychology. He explicitly says he was inspired by Aristotle. Look at his PERMA model. P, positive emotion. E, engagement. R, relationships. M, meaning. A, accomplishment. When these five are present, people flourish. That is eudaimonia. But what does this have to do with life after retirement or life in middle age and beyond? It has much to do with it. Many people collapse after retirement. They feel, I have nothing to do now, I am useless, life is over. Why? Because they saw happiness as external conditions, like position, salary, achievement. When those disappear, happiness disappears too. But Aristotle says differently. Happiness is not external, but internal. It is not about what you do, but how you do it. It is okay not to be a company director. You can display excellence helping organize books at the local library. It is okay not to have big projects. Passing life wisdom to grandchildren is also an activity of reason. Eudaimonia is not a condition, but an attitude. Aristotle at 68 was facing trial. He was at risk of losing everything, but he lived as he taught. For 12 years at the Lyceum, he practiced virtue, used reason, and shared knowledge. That time itself was his eudaimonia. Whatever the outcome, whatever the future, he had already lived a good life. And that is what we can learn. Happiness is not arriving at some point in the future, but practicing it right now in this moment. Were you a little kinder today? Did you learn a little more today? Did you do something a little more meaningful today? If so, today you experienced Eudaimonia, not one swallow, but when daily swallows gather, spring comes. We learned that a good life is activity. Then the next question arises. How should we act? More diligently, more abundantly, more intensely or less, moderately, slowly? Aristotle's answer was clear. The middle, the golden mean. In Greek, mesotes. But we must be careful here. Middle does not mean mathematical average. It does not mean exactly 50-50. The mean that Aristotle speaks of is appropriateness to the situation. Let me give an example. You are on a battlefield. The enemy is attacking. In this moment, what is courage? Is it courage to say, the enemy is scary, but I must fight anyway while trembling and raising your spear? Or is it courage to say fear? What is that? And charge alone into enemy lines? Neither. If you fear too much, it becomes cowardice. If you fear not at all, it becomes recklessness. Courage is somewhere in between. Fearing appropriately, yet doing what must be done despite that. That is courage. Aristotle made a chart like this. Courage, cowardice, deficiency, then courage, the mean, then recklessness, excess. Temperance, insensibility, deficiency, then temperance, the mean, then intemperance, excess. Generosity, stinginess, deficiency, then generosity, the mean, then wastefulness, excess. All virtues have this structure. Too much or too little becomes vice, the right amount becomes virtue. But here a question arises. How do we know what is appropriate? This is it, the essence of the mean. There is no mathematical formula. No equation like courage equals 50% fear plus 50% boldness. It differs by situation, by person, by time. Courage on a battlefield differs from courage in a hospital. Temperance at 20 differs from temperance at 60. The generosity of the rich necessarily differs from the generosity of the poor. Then how do we know? Practical wisdom is needed. In Greek, phronesis. Phronesis is the ability to judge what I should do in this situation. It comes from experience, from deliberation, from trial and error. To use an analogy, it is like cooking. The recipe says add salt appropriately. How much is appropriate? You do not know. You must cook to find out. Once it is too salty, once it is too bland, you keep trying and at some point you think, this much, and it becomes familiar to your hands. The mean is the same. It cannot be written in books, cannot be known only with the head. You learn it by living. So Aristotle said this, quote, without practical wisdom, one cannot be morally good, and without being morally good, one cannot possess practical wisdom, end quote. Sounds like circular logic, right? But it is actually truth. You need wisdom to act rightly, and you need to act rightly to accumulate wisdom. It spirals upward. Act a little, learn a little, act a little better, learn again. It takes a lifetime. What would be the equivalent today? Work-life balance. If you work too much, burnout comes. Relationships crumble, health deteriorates, and eventually you cannot work. If you only play, stagnation. No sense of achievement, meaning disappears, depression sets in. The mean is somewhere in between. Working, resting, learning, playing. But exactly what ratio? 8 hours work? 8 hours sleep? 8 hours leisure? No. Some weeks 12 hours of work, some weeks only 4 hours. Some days you rest deeply, some days you focus all night. It is fluid. It differs by situation, and judging that is phronesis. Smartphones are the same. If you hold it all day long, addiction. Relationships disconnect, concentration drops, anxiety rises. If you do not use it at all, isolation. You become distant from information, disconnected from people, inconvenienced. The mean? Use it when needed, put it down when not needed. But how do you know that boundary? Phronesis tells you. When you think, I am overdoing it now, you put it down. When you think, I have not checked lately, you pick it up. Eating too. Eat too much and obesity, eat too little and malnutrition. The mean is eating appropriately. Exercise 2. Too much and injury, none and weakness. The mean is consistently and moderately. Money 2. Spend too much and bankruptcy, save too much and quality of life drops. The mean is spending and saving with planning. It applies to everything. But there is a trap here, using moderately as an excuse to justify laziness. Quote, it is the mean, right? So I should do it moderately. End quote. This is not it. The mean is not complacency. Rather, it is more difficult. Extremes are easy. All or nothing. 0 or 100. Simple. But the mean is complex. You must continuously adjust, continuously examine, continuously maintain balance. It is like tightrope walking. Aristotle used this metaphor. Quote, hitting the center of the target is difficult, but missing it is easy. End quote. That is right. Living moderately is the most difficult thing. 50s, 60s, 70s. As you move into the latter half of life, this becomes more important. When young, extremes are okay. You recover from all-nighters, excessive playing is fine, mistakes can be made up because there is time. But as you age, one overwork destroys the body. One overeating invites diabetes, one stress can stop the heart. That is why the mean is needed. Appropriately, harmoniously, with balance. Aristotle at 68 already knew all of this. He faced trial, but he neither feared excessively nor did not fear at all. He was appropriately cautious and did what needed to be done. He neither raged excessively nor did not rage at all. He responded appropriately, because that was exactly what he had taught his whole life. The mean is not compromise. It is wisdom. Avoiding extremes, finding harmony, acting according to the situation. That is the art of living well. In your life right now, what is excessive? What is deficient? Look carefully and adjust little by little. There is no perfect balance. But the effort to continuously maintain balance, that itself is the mean. We said activity is needed for eudaimonia. We also said one must live maintaining the mean. But Aristotle says one more thing. Quote, no one would choose to live without friends, even if he possessed all other goods. End quote. Even with money, honor, and health, without friends you cannot be happy. Why? Because humans cannot live alone. Remember the saying, humans are by nature political animals. We can only become fully human within community, and the deepest form of that community is friendship. But Aristotle did not view friendship simply. He divided friendship into 3 types. First, friendship based on utility. Relationships formed because you are mutually helpful. Business partners, colleagues, neighbors. You are useful to me and I am useful to you, so let us be friends. It is not bad. It is a necessary relationship. But there is a problem. When utility disappears, the relationship ends too. You were close with a work colleague, but after quitting, contact was cut off. Experience that. You were close with a neighbor, but after moving, you do not even greet each other anymore. Experience that? That is friendship of utility. Conditions are attached. Second, friendship based on pleasure. Relationships formed because being together is enjoyable. Hobby friends, drinking buddies, exercise partners. Being with you is fun, so let us be friends. This is not bad either. It brings vitality to life. But again, there is a problem. When pleasure disappears, the relationship also fades. Aristotle says, quote, such friendships are common among the young because young people live pursuing pleasure. End quote. This is why friends you partied with all night when young scatter as you age. Because the standard of pleasure changes. Some people come to like golf, some like hiking, some prefer quietly reading books. Then what is true friendship? Third, friendship based on virtue. A relationship where you love the person's character itself. You are a good person. You are my friend because of your very existence. It is okay without benefit. Okay without fun. They are precious simply because they are that person. Aristotle expressed it this way. Quote, a friend is a single soul dwelling in 2 bodies. End quote. A second self. Another me. That is a true friend. But such friendship is rare. Why is it rare? Because it takes a long time. Aristotle says, quote, to be friends, You must eat a bushel of salt together. End quote. What does that mean? You must share many meals together. You must spend much time, have many conversations, and know each other deeply. It cannot be made hastily. Not in 1 year, and perhaps even 10 years may not be enough. And above all, both people must be virtuous. An evil person cannot have true friends, because an evil person does not even love himself. How can someone who does not love himself truly love another person? In contrast, a virtuous person loves himself. He respects himself living rightly, so he can recognize, respect, and love someone similar. How would this look in today's world? Look at social media. 500 friends on Facebook, 1,000 followers on Instagram. But when you are in trouble, how many people can you actually call? If Aristotle were alive, what would he say? Quote, "Those are not friends, they are acquaintances." End quote. Not friendship of utility, not friendship of pleasure, just a state of being connected. Relationships without substance. The bigger problem is this. When you have many superficial relationships, there is no time to form real ones. To eat a bushel of salt together requires time, but if you divide that time among 500 people, how many minutes per person? True friendship is not made that way. After retirement or after middle age, many people feel something. Quote, "I am alone." End quote. Company colleagues stopped contacting after you quit, because it was friendship of utility. Drinking buddies naturally drifted away when you quit drinking for health reasons, because it was friendship of pleasure. Then what remains? Did you have real friends? Aristotle says true friends cannot be many. Perhaps 1 or 2 in a lifetime is enough. Then it is not too late even now. Find even one person. No, create one. Because true friendship is not discovered, it is made. Invest time. Eat meals together, take walks, have conversations. Rejoice in the other's growth, share difficulties, speak honestly. That is eating a bushel of salt together. And above all, become a virtuous person yourself. Only a person trying to live rightly can recognize and attract someone similar. When you become a good person, good people are bound to come. Aristotle lost Hermeias. He lost Pythias and grew distant from Alexander. But he had Theophrastus, the student who dissected octopuses with him on Lesbos, the colleague who founded and ran the Lyceum together, the successor who took over the school after Aristotle died. The two of them ate a bushel of salt together. Rain or shine, they walked the Peripatos together, discussed metaphysics late into the night, read each other's manuscripts, and gave advice. That was true friendship. Do you have such a person? Or are you creating one? Aristotle says, quote, "Having friends is more the essence of friendship than being loved." End quote. Not receiving but giving. That is friendship. Contact someone first today, an old friend, or someone who could become a friend. Quote, "Shall we have a meal?" End quote. A bushel of salt begins that way. Is having friends enough? Aristotle says no. Friends are important, but that alone is not sufficient. Humans need something broader, namely community. One of his most famous sentences, quote, "Man is by nature a political animal." End quote. The original Greek goes like this, ho anthropos physei politikon zoon. It is usually translated as political, which causes some misunderstanding. It is not politics as we think of it, elections, parties, power struggles. Politikon comes from polis, polis the city-state, community. Translated again, it goes like this. Man is by nature a communal animal. We cannot live alone. Only within community can we truly become fully human. Why? Aristotle explains it this way. Because humans have logos. This is also a difficult word to translate. It encompasses speech, reason, and logic all at once. Animals also make sounds. Dogs bark, birds chirp, lions roar. They can express pain and joy. But only humans possess logos. Beyond simply saying it hurts, we can discuss what is just, what is good, what is beneficial. And because of this capacity, the polis community becomes possible. Wolves also form packs, ants also live in groups, but they move by instinct. Humans, in contrast, discuss together, reach consensus, make laws, and pursue justice. Aristotle says it extremely. Quote, "One who can live alone is either a beast or a god." End quote. Living completely alone is not human. Without community, we cannot be fully human. Then what is a good community? Aristotle classified political systems into 6 types. First, he divides by who rules. One person, a few, many. Then he asks again, for the common good or for the ruler's benefit? Making a chart like this: one person for the common good, kingship; one person for private interest, tyranny; a few for the common good, aristocracy; a few for private interest, oligarchy; many for the common good, polity; many for private interest, democracy. Wait, democracy is bad? In Aristotle's time, democracy meant something different from today. It meant a system where the poor majority plundered the rich, governing by mob emotion rather than law. In contrast, good rule by the many was called politeia, or polity. This was the system Aristotle saw as most ideal. Kingship is good if the king is wise, but if a foolish king comes, it ends. Aristocracy is good if the elite few are competent, but when they become corrupt, it becomes oligarchy. But polity is different. The middle class is central, law rules and extremes are avoided. It is the most stable and realistic system. Here too the mean appears. The mean is needed even in politics. But what does this have to do with retired middle-aged people? It has much to do with it. After retirement, many people experience identity confusion. Who am I? At work, they were a section chief, a department head, an executive. They had business cards, had a role, had a position. But after retirement, they are nothing. No business card, no role, no position. What am I now? Many people collapse before this question. They just stay home, just watch TV, just kill time. The wife nags, "What are you doing at home?" and they themselves become lethargic. Why? Because they lost their role in community. They feel as if they are no longer members of the polis. Aristotle said it, didn't he? Humans are communal animals. We become fully human by having a role in community. Then the answer is clear. Find a new community. Create a new role. The company was one community, but it is not the only community. There are communities in the neighborhood too. Libraries, welfare centers, volunteer organizations, clubs, churches, temples, online communities. Quote, "But what would I do there?" End quote. Do what you did before, in a different way. If you did accounting at a company, help with financial management at a non-profit. If you did sales, teach marketing to small neighborhood businesses. If you did HR, provide interview coaching to young people. Your career is not useless. Where you use it has changed. Or you can start something completely new. Learn an instrument you never learned in life and join a neighborhood amateur orchestra. Learn writing and write columns for the local newspaper. Learn woodworking and make toys for neighborhood children. What matters is the role. Feeling I am a meaningful existence in this community. That I am contributing, that I am needed, that I am connected. That is living as the political animal Aristotle spoke of. Aristotle, who was a metokos, ironically understood this best. He could not become an Athenian citizen, but he created a community called the Lyceum. There he was a teacher, a researcher, a leader. Students needed him, and he contributed to students. In afternoon lectures, Athenian citizens came too. He had no voting rights, but he shared knowledge. That too was contribution. At 68, he faced trial, but for 12 years he had performed a meaningful role. As head of the Lyceum, as teacher to students, as transmitter of knowledge. That is what kept him alive. You are the same. Just because you are old, retired, have no title, does not mean it is over. You still have logos. You can speak, think, and contribute. Then find community and create a role. Small is fine. Helping organize books at the neighborhood library, being a companion at a welfare center, sharing advice online, all are meaningful roles. Because you are by nature a communal animal, and community needs you. He said living alone makes you either beast or god, right? You are neither. You are human, and humans must live together. If you have listened this far, you probably know Aristotle was a great person. He taught Eudaimonia, preached the mean, awakened us to the value of friendship, and emphasized the importance of community. But now we must tell an uncomfortable story. Aristotle was not perfect. No, in some ways he was seriously wrong. First, slavery. In Book 1 of the Politics, this passage appears, quote, "He who is human, yet by nature not his own but another's, is by nature a slave." End quote. What does this mean? That some people are destined from birth to be slaves. People with insufficient rational capacity, especially non-Greeks, cannot judge for themselves and therefore need masters. He even says this is beneficial for them too. Absurd, right? Worse, this logic has been historically abused. The Valladolid debate in Spain in 1550. It was a discussion about whether it was acceptable to enslave American indigenous people. Those who favored slavery cited Aristotle. Quote, "See, the great philosopher said there are natural slaves." End quote. Aristotle's words were used to justify the suffering of millions. What about women? In On the Generation of Animals, this appears. Quote, "The female is as it were an incomplete male." End quote. Incomplete male, an unfinished being, a deficient human. In the Politics, he goes further. Women have rational capacity but lack authority. Therefore, they should stay in the home and cannot participate in politics. He even made biologically incorrect statements. Quote, "Women have fewer teeth than men." End quote. The person who emphasized direct observation said this without even looking in his wife's mouth. Prejudice blinded even observation. Scientific errors are even more numerous. In astronomy, he advocated geocentrism. The Earth is the center of the universe, and the sun and stars revolve around Earth. This error dominated Western science for 1,800 years. In physics, he said, quote, "Heavy objects fall faster than light objects." End quote. Galileo disproved this by experiment 1,900 years later. In biology, he believed in spontaneous generation. Eels spontaneously arise from mud, flies spontaneously appear from rotting meat. Why did these errors persist so long? Because Aristotle's authority was too great. Aristotle said so became proof itself. Questioning it became impious. When the medieval church adopted his philosophy, the situation worsened. Doubting Aristotle became doubting the church. Looking at all this is disappointing. The person who taught Eudaimonia defended slavery. The person who preached the mean discriminated against women. The person who emphasized observation was blinded by prejudice. Is this not contradiction? It is contradiction, but it is also human. There is something we can learn here. Even the greatest philosopher can be trapped by the limitations of his time. Slavery was prevalent throughout ancient Greece, and the legal subordination of women was common sense across the entire Mediterranean world at that time. Aristotle was a genius, but he was also a son of his era. That does not excuse it. Plato lived in the same era, but was less certain about slavery. Socrates thought women could be educated too. Aristotle could have chosen, but he did not choose. But here is the thing. Are we not the same? 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when people look back at the 2020s, which of our common sense will they view as barbarism? Among the things we take for granted now, what might future generations find as horrifying as Aristotle's defense of slavery? We cannot answer easily, because we too are within our time. The lesson Aristotle gives us is this: no one is perfect. Everyone has blind spots, prejudices, and makes mistakes. What matters is acknowledging that fact. Quote, "I too can be wrong. I too may have things I cannot see. What I take for granted now may later be something shameful." End quote. This humility is needed, and at the same time continuing forward despite imperfection. Aristotle got many things wrong, but got many things right. The founding of logic, the foundation of virtue ethics, analysis of political systems, the basis of comparative anatomy, the theory of tragedy, these still have value. He was not perfect, but he was still great. And when we see his human side, he becomes more relatable. What did he look like? According to ancient records, this, thin legs, small eyes, a voice that lisped because of a short tongue, stooped posture and bald. But he dressed flamboyantly, wore multiple rings, styled his hair nicely, followed fashionable trends. In conservative Athenian philosophical circles, this was worthy of criticism. Quote, "Why does a philosopher adorn himself so much?" End quote. But Aristotle did not care. He wore what he wanted to wear. He had wit too. When he heard news that someone had spoken ill of him behind his back, he supposedly said this, quote, "As long as I am not present, they may whip me." End quote. His sleeping habits were unique too. He is said to have slept holding a bronze ball in his hand with a copper basin placed below. When sleep deepened, the ball would fall and the sound would wake him to continue his research. He was a severe workaholic. Looking at these aspects, we can see he was just like us. He had appearance complexes, cared about fashion, made jokes, and was obsessed with work. He was not a perfect saint, but a flawed human. And that is actually comforting. You too do not need to be perfect. It is okay to make mistakes, okay to be wrong, okay to have blind spots. What matters is not stopping, continuing to learn, continuing to try to improve, continuing to contribute. That is what Aristotle did. He got much wrong but did not stop. Until 68, he continued teaching, researching, writing, sharing. And that imperfect life has traveled down 2,400 years to reach us today. Your imperfect life can do the same. It can reach someone, because even without perfection, it can be meaningful. We return to the prologue. Late summer, 323 BC. The night 68-year-old Aristotle left Athens. Quote, "I will not permit the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy." End quote. He fled. He did not drink poison like Socrates. Was it cowardice or was it wisdom? Probably both. And it was human. The ship headed north, to Chalcis on the island of Euboea, his mother Phaestus's hometown. He was returning to the place he had left 60 years ago. Chalcis was a quiet place. The sea was visible, wind blew, it was peaceful. Aristotle rented a house there. Herpyllis and his son Nicomachus were with him. A few students also followed. He entrusted the Lyceum, built over 12 years, to Theophrastus. Quote, "You carry it on, continue teaching while walking the paths." End quote. Exile life began. In the mornings he walked by the sea. The Lyceum's peripatos was not there, but he walked and thought alone. In the afternoons he wrote. He organized unfinished manuscripts. In the evenings he ate with family. These were quiet days, not glamorous. Not many students, no lectures, no library. But they were peaceful. He had lived 68 years. He lost his parents early, lost his teacher, lost his friend, lost his wife. He was not chosen as successor, grew distant from his student, lost his nephew, and was ultimately driven out. He gained much, but lost much. Yet strangely, in Chalcis he seemed peaceful. Why? Perhaps because he lived as he taught. He said Eudaimonia is not external conditions, but activity. In Chalcis there was still reason, still inquiry, still people he loved. He lived maintaining the mean. He neither raged excessively nor grieved excessively. He accepted the situation and did what he could. And 1 year passed. Autumn 322 BC, Aristotle fell ill. It is said to have been a digestive ailment, probably a stomach ulcer or stomach cancer. He grew weaker, could not eat food, lost weight, found it hard to rise from bed. He knew death was approaching. So he wrote a will. Diogenes Laertius preserved that will. 2,300 years later, we can still read it. The first sentence is impressive. Quote, "All will be well, but if anything should happen, Aristotle disposes as follows." End quote. All will be well. For a sentence from an old man facing death, it is too optimistic. But this is Aristotle-like. Not anxious, calm, preparing. Shall we look at the content? First, he designated an executor, Antipater, regent of Macedon, the most trustworthy person. He directed that his adopted son, Nicanor, Hermeias' nephew, marry his daughter Pythias. Quote, "Take good care of my daughter." End quote. Then comes the clause about Herpyllis. Quote, to Herpyllis give 1 talent of silver, 3 maidservants and 1 manservant, and either the house in Chalcis or the cottage at Stagira, whichever she chooses, and let her take the furniture she desires. End quote. He was generous. Though not legally his wife, he treated her as his lifelong companion. He was attentive to the slaves too. Quote, when my daughter marries, free the following slaves Ambrasis, Thales, Tycho, Philo. End quote. He wrote down each name. He remembered them. And he stated explicitly, quote, do not sell Herpyllis' son. Do not sell any of the boys who served me. End quote. In the customs of that time, when the master died, slaves were often sold to settle the estate. But Aristotle prevented that. It is ironic. The person who theoretically defended slavery actually treated his own slaves as human beings. Was it a gap between theory and practice? Or did he know deep down that his theory was wrong? We cannot know. But what is certain is that his actions were more human than his words. And the final clause, quote, move Pythias' remains to beside my tomb and bury us together, for she instructed that this be done. End quote. His first wife, Hermeias' adopted daughter, the woman who passed away early on the island of Lesbos. More than 20 years had passed. He had lived with a second wife and had a son. But in his final moment, he remembered Pythias. Love lasts that long. Having finished writing the will, Aristotle put down his pen. A few days later, he quietly closed his eyes. 322 BC. He was 62 years old. The funeral was simple. No elaborate ceremony, no many mourners. Only family and a few students gathered. His remains were buried somewhere in Chalcis. The exact location is not known. It has not been found even today. But his words remained. Students of the Lyceum preserved the manuscripts. Theophrastus took them over, and his successor took them over in turn. From parchment to papyrus, from papyrus to books, from books to digital. 2,400 years have passed. Aristotle's body disappeared, but his voice is still heard. Quote, all human beings by nature desire to know. End quote. Quote, one swallow does not make a spring. End quote. Quote, no one would choose to live without friends. End quote. Quote, man is by nature a political animal. End quote. These sentences touch someone's heart today as well. Then what will we leave behind? Wealth, honor, achievements? All are important. But what Aristotle's will shows is something else. Relationships. People. He cared for Herpyllis, freed slaves, remembered Pythias. He earnestly entreated care for his daughter and left the school to his students. In his final moment, what he cared about were people. You will be the same. At the end of life, what matters is not how much you earned, how high you climbed. It is who you loved, to whom you were kind, whom you helped. Aristotle was not perfect. He defended slavery, discriminated against women, made many scientific errors. But at the same time, he tried to learn throughout his life, tried to teach, tried to contribute. And to the very end, he did not forget people. This is what we can learn. You do not need to be perfect. You just need to keep moving forward. We said Eudaimonia is not a destination, but a journey. Today, too, learn a little, give a little, love a little. Live maintaining the mean, neither excessive nor deficient, appropriate to the situation, flexibly. Cherish friendship. Find someone to eat a bushel of salt with. Invest time, share sincerity. Participate in community. Even a small role is fine, because you are a needed person. And in the final moment, if you can say like Aristotle, quote, all will be well, end quote. Without anxiety, without regret, peacefully, I did what I could. Not perfectly, but I did my best. I loved, I learned, I shared. That is enough. On a quiet night in Chalcis, a 68-year-old man breathed his last. But his voice has crossed 2,400 years to reach you today. And your voice will reach someone too. It is okay not to be perfect. Keep moving forward. Keep loving. Keep learning. Because that is living well. Until now, we have walked this deep path of contemplation with Aristotle. Now it is time to walk your own path. Time to find your own eudaimonia. Today, try to live maintaining the mean a little more. Contact an old friend. Find a small community where you can contribute. Not one swallow, but when daily swallows gather, spring comes. If this journey has been meaningful to you, please support us with a subscription and a like. We will return with more stories that matter. Thank you for listening.